I had some family obligations I had to get linked into. But I've read your book.
Okay.
So
So
I
you
did
read the
read
chat.
it. I did. I read the book in its entirety, broken. Um, and I have been a social worker now for 30 years.
Wow.
Uh, and a lot of the questions that it raised are questions that I have always had
Mm,
in relation to child protection and who are we really protecting? Because I've had the opportunity to work with families from affluent communities as well as from families who are in communities that are deeply below the poverty line. And I noted, just like you did in your book, and I think just like your experiences showed you from living in Florida, that that although in my experience, in working with families from affluent communities, I worked with one family where there was gross negligence and abuse across generations, and the authorities never really responded to that family um, in the same way that it responded to so swiftly to families whose parents were navigating substance abuse in the 90s, especially, when crack was involved. So it's like if I called and had to make a report because of a parent's neglect related to their substance abuse, um, the response was always very swift, and severe because children would immediately be removed. But I remember the conversation around this one affluent family that I got to work with. And there were so many people in that office that day when we were making the decision whether or not to make the call to protective services because of the standing that this family had in the community and the wealth that they had. And even though the call was made because kids were being harmed, um, that was it. They just made a call, and then it was like, all right, they're going to continue to have therapy. They're going to stay in this home. It's like, and I said this is absolutely absurd. So a lot of the revelations that you shared in the book are experiences that I've actually had. So I want to thank you for that, because I think that a lot of folks don't realize how how slighted or how slanted the system is.
agreed. Agreed. Thank you for sharing your experiences.
Mhm.
Really appreciate that. I was going to ask you. I think you're supposed to ask the questions, but I have one for you.
Okay, go ahead.
I guess we're gonna do a joint interview. No, but you said
Okay,
you did
okay.
CPS work. So were you a CPS worker or were you?
No, no, I've never been a CPS worker. I've worked
Got it.
no, I've only worked in settings with children.
Got it.
So as a
Mandate,
therapist,
mandated report.
supervisor, mandated reporter,
Got it.
right, primarily in community mental health and in schools. Mm-hmm.
No, I think it's great that you are chatting with me because the book is really for the child's welfare workforce, but also their community partners, teachers, lawyers, police officers, physicians. So I'm glad to hear that you did the work of social work tangential to CPS because it's a really
Yes.
good illustration of how important this topic is.
Yes. And I think too, so one thing that I thought was interesting is about the training for CPS workers around personal bias.
Mhm.
So because most people don't know that to be a child protective service worker, you don't have to have a master's degree in social work in many states. Uh, so and I'm not clear that, so you can tell us, what is your knowledge about the minimum education requirement for a child protective service worker?
Like you said, in some states, not many, you need to have a master's in social work, but a lot of states have lowered that because there's just so much turnover. The workforce has been so unstable. So in many states, as early as a year and a half ago, here in my home state, they lowered it to a GED, a high school diploma, associate's degree, and they just want to really put a focus on training. They didn't want to have the educational requirement because of the people they needed, but they wanted to bring in more people and then really focus on equipping them and training them in the work.
Oh my gosh. And then so and you mentioned that your training to become a child protective service worker. So it was basically a month.
It was 9 weeks, and
Okay.
some days we were in class, some days we were out in the field observing and watching our supervisors and our mentors. So, but I also did an internship, which was pretty common during that time because we had this program called the Title IV-E program that provided funding for students that were going to go into child welfare. So they took care of your
Mhm.
tuition and gave you a stipend and paid for your housing. Again, with the understanding that you would go into the child welfare field and sort of repay back that time by working in the field. So I did a full internship before I started working. So that's a lot more than what most do, for sure.
So it's not even ran because I'm thinking about how police are also trained.
Mm.
Um and you know, because to be a police officer, you can of course go straight to the police academy right out of high school. Um so you can go right out of high school, but then you have to go to the academy. So you're at the academy longer than you are in training as a CPS worker.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I didn't know how long people go to the police academy.
Yeah, so it's about 2 semesters worth of time. So it's like 1 year of community college to be at the police academy. And I'm not sure if that's different across states, but CPS workers are of course first responders, just like police and firefighters. And then when police officers, of course, complete their academy training, then they are a rookie. So they are basically an intern, who are under the guise of a more seasoned officer. And it's a similar scenario with firefighters. So then once you complete your training with Child Protective Services, what you just get a caseload, like you don't get you're not a rookie with a ride and a ride along, you're like out there by yourself.
Well, I think they try very hard during the training 9 weeks for you to be in the field, riding along, doing those observational types of things. And then when you are done with training, a lot of organizations try to put you on a protected caseload, which means you do start getting cases, but not nearly as many as you're going to end up getting, right? So they try to bring you in as slowly as possible because even that first case, your first case is going to feel like 10, once you start getting the
Yeah.
case. So they do try to bring you in a staggered sort of way. This discussion around training and education is definitely a big one. I think that we're still trying to figure it out as a profession, who should be in the workforce, who shouldn't. There's been a lot of research, and I will say it's inconclusive on if social work is the right field for child protective services. I like to think that it is, probably because I'm a social worker, and I feel like we could really do the work and do it well, particularly if we try to commit to that internal work and training and introspection. But research shows that a lot of social workers come into this field and they exit pretty quickly. A lot of them are trying to get experience, a lot of them are becoming clinicians. So many states are pivoting away from the focus on social work.
And the pivot is going towards what?
Other areas like criminal justice, um, there was a program here in Florida that we're actually bringing in previous veterans into the CPS world. They also are bringing in people from like child and family sciences, humanities, um, areas like that. Again, largely focused on training, not exactly your educational background.
Hmm. Now that is That's crazy, right? Because I mean, you don't give a police officer a gun without the training and education. Okay. So that aside, um, what do you think would have, even with you having had the internship and then of course having the 9 weeks of training, um, what do you think would have really supported you in moving from intern, newly minted CPS worker into really getting comfortable into that position and feeling supported? What do you think was missing that could have made the transition for you more seamless?
So I believe that the way the child welfare system is set up today, um, the transition from intern to training to the field is going the way that it is designed to. You're supposed to come in, get your cases, and really move about in a policing oriented fashion.
Yeah.
What I am trying to really encourage the profession to do and um, challenge them to do is to consider doing that work differently. So the way in which I came into the field, I think it was probably well done if that's your standard. We got her in, we had an internship with her. We had her trained. She went out with the best of our
Yeah.
workforce and learned from them. But we're all doing what the system is asking us to do. And that's why I'm advocating for, I think we're all the system. So if we start to shift what we do, if we start to ask more questions, if we start to push back, perhaps the system will begin to think about how we're harming families and how we're impacting families. So as far as my transition into the field, I think it was fine, but it's because that's the way the field is. And I didn't come in questioning the field. I didn't come in thinking, why are we doing it this way? Why are we doing it that way? It just felt like we were doing these tasks, rudimentary, sort of compliance driven things without wondering how the person on the other end is actually being impacted by what we're doing. And I think that that is still going on today in many states. But there are some brave souls that are finally saying, we can do this work differently. And it's just going to
Mhm.
take more people coming on board to really think through what they're actually doing and why. To your earlier point, where you talked about a family that actually really needed CPS intervention. I was recently asked to do an interview, but I couldn't do it because I was going to be on a plane. But the interview was about a little girl. Maybe you've heard about it. She died 2 weeks ago, and
Mm.
she was starved. She was starved in her home by her parents, and it was very, very egregious neglect. And there was a CPS worker in her home on the day she died. So you can imagine how she must have been that day if that was the day she passed away. So I was asked to talk about how, to your earlier point, if we actually get really clear about what is abuse, what are the standards, what's going to be our protocols, because right now it really varies depending on who's out in the field, who are
Mhm.
you, who mentored you, who trained you,
Mhm.
what. But if we get really clear on what we're actually doing in the field, I think the kids that need us will get us, and the families that don't need surveillance and the policing aspect of our work will actually be able to go a different route and get their needs met. And again, we can pivot toward the families and the kids who actually need protection. So again, I didn't get a chance to do that interview, but they wanted me to talk about how so much of the workforce are dealing with issues around, like you said, poverty, issues around the housing crisis. My book talks about 3 or 4 different families that were evicted and then ultimately were reported to CPS. Like these are the sorts of things I really want folks to think about. Who needs protection, and how do we get our workforce to really know how to go about doing that in the most effective way?
Because there was a time here in the state of Michigan where we had a pretty robust prevention aspect to child protective services. So because you know that and this would have been in the late 90s, early 2000s, um, it was a pretty robust program with prevention. So it was like a family would be reported for child protective services, and they would immediately be taken into preventive services because it was really issues related to poverty. So they didn't have proper housing, there wasn't transportation, there was issues with the housing that they had. It was inadequate, right? So no heat, no running water, things like that. So instead of coming in and taking a more punitive approach and removing kids immediately, preventive services through child protection actually created treatment plans, and then they also funneled families into wraparound services, which was another component of child welfare. So of course, for some reason, around 2010, 2012, that type of programming just like dried up. And I'm wondering then, if that were more the norm, how how we could mitigate the harm or minimize or eliminate even some of the harm that is caused through CPS's intervention. Have you found other states that have similar prevention services?
Yes. And the issue really, well, I think, is that a lot of these services are connected to CPS, because you're absolutely right. There are some, special tracks for certain families. But a lot of us in this field that are really trying to push for fundamental changes in the system, we actually want families to be able to get their needs met by a completely different entity. I do not think that the CPS system should be trying to eradicate poverty, right? Should be trying to figure out poverty. And just so people on the call are clear about neglect versus poverty, neglect is a big word in our system.
Yes.
And it's like 76% of the cases we get are due to neglect. And when you think about neglect, willful neglect, I mean, harmful, egregious, it's parents that have what their kids need, but they don't give it.
Right.
They really are withholding, like the story I
Right.
just told you, this white
Right.
family.
Where they're withholding food. Right.
This white family put their daughter in a
Right.
closet, and that is where she passed away just a few weeks ago. So that is someone who's holding something that they have. Poverty is that these parents don't have what their kids need, so their kids go without. And then a teacher sees a child stealing food, or a teacher sees a child in the same outfit for the 8th day in a row, and they start to say, oh, something's going on with this kid. So then CPS is in that kid's family, sending them to services that are connected to CPS. But then, Dr. Dorothy Roberts has a lot of work on surveillance. As long as you're connected to the CPS system, even for prevention services, you're under surveillance.
Yes,
and
right.
a lot of families are becoming very, very apprehensive because they don't trust. If you're connected to the CPS system, there's a lack of trust there, and for good reason.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what are some of the reasons that families would
like
not
my book talks about, people that were evicted, went in to get help with housing, and the next thing they knew, they had a CPS worker at their door. So what are the odds of that person going back to try to get help with housing? Now they don't trust even a housing social worker. I mean, these people aren't even a part of the CPS system, but in some ways they are informally. So I think that's one big thing. When they go to try to get help, they end up, being more visible to mandated reporters.
And what do you think, and why do you think that so many people in child welfare and social work are so quick to pull the CPS card for families? Because it's like I feel like in school settings, in child welfare programs, in other places where children are being served, there is confusion around how they might serve and protect the children that are coming into their care. So, and I'm wondering then from your perspective, having done this study, how much do you think we need to invest in educating the quote unquote mandated reporters? Because they're reporting things and therefore putting families under surveillance when the services that the family actually is in need of is in their space. like like they're there because you were there to help them. They're having a housing issue. You're the housing authority, and you're calling CPS because they don't have housing. Or you could, if they could just be on your caseload and you could get them housing.
Mhm. Well, the first thing I'll say is I think a lot of mandated reporters probably don't know what services are available. And if they do know what services are available, they're a long waiting list. So mandated reporters that I talk to, they say, well, Jessica, I don't know what else to do. You know, the mom came in and she said she's being evicted in 30 days and she has nowhere to go. So I had to call CPS and say, hey, these kids are going to be out on the street in 30 days. So people feel somewhat like they don't know what to do. Their hands are tied and they're doing what the law says to do. There is a contingency of people in this country right now that are fighting hour on the hour to repeal the policy that created mandated reporting because
Mm.
we have people who feel like they don't feel like it. They are mandated by law to make these reports. And I think that it's important to know that people are doing that, A, because again, they don't know what else to do. And then B, it is their civic duty, so to speak. So I believe that, at least what I'm advocating in the book, is that if we take a pause and consider having a conversation with our colleagues or having a conversation with the parents, particularly, in a hospital or education setting, I'm always hoping people can slow down the call to CPS. And I know my former colleagues and CPS workers everywhere are probably nodding right now, thinking, yeah, because a lot of these cases we get really shouldn't be our cases. I remember getting cases when I was in the field thinking, why is this a case? Why do I have to go in and investigate this family? Right. So I think if we get clearer about what is the actual abuse, as we talked about before, what is a need, and how do we pause and again become a mandated supporter as we're trying to really shift instead of a mandated reporter. And I have some resources in the back of my book for people like in neighborhoods, teachers, clinicians who are thinking, well, what do I do if I have a concern? And there's a list of questions that I really hope they stop and ask themselves before they bring CPS to that family's front door.
So there was one family, and you do have case studies. I'm a social worker. So you have families that you share their stories in the book. There was this one young family that really stood out for me, who's who the mother eventually lost her parental rights.
Mm-hmm.
And it all began because the doctor filed a report against her. And that's one case where I was like, the baby was in the hospital and she'd been asking for care and trying to get advice all along, and no one was responding to her. And so that made me wonder then, what would the response have been if they had been a young white family?
Well, we'll be thinking about that question probably for many, many more years because I know exactly what family you're talking about in the book. And that really was a disturbing, very stunning case
Heartbreaking.
on many levels.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that when there is a medically fragile child, there are a lot of alarm bells. I understand that from being in the field, right? We have a doctor in the mix. We have nurses in the mix. We have a baby that has a lot of injuries in the mix. We have a lot of things to consider in this moment. But as you can see in that book, and as the folks who read the book can see, I believe there were several opportunities over the course of the 5 years that case happened. I think it was 4 to 5 years. There were lots of opportunities to course correct and pull that family back together, but we never did. So to your point, when there's this medical diagnosis, I know that it's very complex. I know that CPS might have to make some decisions up front, but I just hate it that how it devolves over the course of 5 years.
And it really, so that particular family story really did start to feel kind of like a true crime story, because it's
Mm,
like, who hurt the baby?
mm-hmm.
Right. And then you're listening to the mom's perspective and how protective she was. She had a traumatic birth with the baby. There was another son in the house. And then her mother was dying from cancer. It was just, there was so many things happening around this young family that just completely gutted me. And in the meantime, I kept thinking there are all these quote unquote helpers,
Mhm.
and no one is helping.
Mm.
Like even when she first had when the baby was born, and it was born so traumatically, like
Mhm.
premature birth, there's all this drama and trauma around his birth, right?
Mhm.
And she went into distress, the baby went into distress. It's just, and then he's get all these medical diagnoses. Um, it shocked me. It just stunned me that no one in the hospital, the medical social worker, no one put a plan in place to support that family. And all I kept thinking was, shame on you, Duke. Like,
Mm.
just shame on you, North Carolina. Like, no one at any point saw this young family and made a decision at that point to really provide them with support and a plan. Because there was no, it was, I was like, this could have been prevented on so many levels. In so many, why didn't she have a visiting nurse? And I'm thinking about the timeline. I was like, where's birth to three? Like, what is happening in North Carolina?
Well, it's not just North Carolina. So
Right,
I hear
right,
your
right.
outrage. I hear your outrage and I share it because that story, sadly, is happening in so many other states. And when people read that story, I ask them, so could that happen in your state? Could that happen in
Yeah.
your state? Could that happen in your state? And there's an emphatic yes when I'm asking professionals. I wish I wish they would say, oh no, that's an anomaly. That could never happen here. But I haven't got that in response yet. They're like, oh yeah, this could happen here. Just like that. And that's important for people to know. If they read that story and they read the story around this family and it starts to sink into them that this is not a unique story.
No.
I think that I hope that galvanizes them to think differently about the work and also think twice about pushing a family into this system because once you're in, it's really hard to get out. Even
And
when
you
you're
kept
case
seeing,
in, it's really hard to get
right,
out.
and you kept seeing through this family story because, and through the other families as well, because there was a similar situation with the young woman in Florida who
Mm.
took on a child. She brought a kid into her house, completely unrelated to her, and just trying to do the best that she can to care for this baby, who was abandoned. So she takes in this baby who's abandoned, and she's trying not to get the mother in any more trouble by filing, right? And she gets deeper and deeper into a hole. Again, no support. The daycare center, instead of saying, you know what, there's a parenting class down the street.
Mm.
Let me get you some resources, see if we can sign you up. I see that you're struggling. I know that you're a young mom. You're not even technically the foster parent. So it showed me the so many ways that um the families that we're supposed to be designed to serve get lost, and then not only lost but then victimized by the very system that was supposedly created to help them. um okay,
Yeah,
so with that being so with that being said, I would like to have you talk a little bit about your movement from advocate to activist and how you made that transition.
Jatoya's story you just talked about. That one propelled me into activism and
Yeah.
along with Saisha's story. Yeah, I think that the thing about being an advocate, because I know there's a lot of people that say, well, that's a really positive word. You know, why can't we stay with advocacy? And I think for some of us, and for many people that have read the book and it's resonating with them, we can sort of get stuck there. We're starting to call it admiring the problem. We just start admiring it. We're not really, moving forward and actually doing anything about it. So in the advocacy phase, you really are getting better and trying your best to understand the issues more, but you're not really pushing against the status quo. And I think once I saw that case and how it unfolded, I really said, okay, I cannot be quiet about this anymore. I cannot just let this stuff keep happening. I cannot be afraid of what the truth might do. And I think that's what activism is. It's sharing your truth, sharing the truth, and trying your best to hope that it resonates with folks that encounter the truth about the Child Protective Services system. Again, I am a person who believes we need the CPS system, but they're not able to really focus on what they should be focused on. And that's what I'm trying to say in the book. The story you brought up about the young woman who took a child in, tried to be a kinship care placement, did the best she could. That is a glaring description of someone who needed help.
Mm-hmm.
People who read the book see it clearly, but the people that were actually walking through that situation somehow missed it, and that's just strange to me. But that is a very, very clear story about someone who needed help, and we took a child that had already been, like you said, abandoned. We took them again out of a home that they felt like they belonged and loved and cared for. So I think that we just doubly traumatized this child, even though we were there to keep them safe. So it's really oxymoronic when you think about it.
And it's so because you don't even go with your own instinct. And I saw that in each of the caseworkers that you shared their side of the story of. It's like you could tell that they were when they took a moment and thought about it, they were like, this doesn't make sense, but this is what I have to do. Right? This
You
is
know,
what I got to do.
yeah, there is a study out of Stanford, and people that are on this call, please look it up because it's fascinating. There's a study out of Stanford, it's years old, where they had these students that were told by their professors to basically push a button and send an electric shock to someone in the other room. You know about this story.
Yeah,
If
yeah,
they
yeah.
if they missed a question, these students had to shock them.
Right.
Now, unbeknownst to the students, they weren't really shocking these people. Like, it was all fake. The people were
Right,
acting,
right.
but these students, they just kept shocking. They just kept shocking. And the people in the room would say, up the voltage, up the voltage. And the students would just keep shocking them and keep shocking them. And they'd say, up the voltage. And it got to a voltage that would kill these people.
Yeah, yeah.
And they kept pushing it. And afterwards, they asked the students, you actually saw the harm that you were doing. And you didn't really seem that comfortable with it, but you just kept pushing the button. Why did you do that? And their response was, because this person told me to. And I think about that study a lot because, to your earlier point, until the child welfare workforce says, I'm not going to keep doing this, right?
Right.
I'm not going to keep doing the same thing that I see I've been doing for years. Now that I know the harm that's being done, I want this book to be a window and a mirror, right? I want the book to be a window that they can see out of, because sometimes you get insulated in this work and all you can see is your grind, and what you can see
Right.
is your next
Right.
step. I want them to see this book as a window to look out at other ways of thinking, other ways to imagine this work. But it also needs to be a mirror, because I want them to read about the things they do every day. And many of them have said to me, I didn't like what I was reading. And I said, well, what are you going to do about that?
Right. Because if you don't like how you're reading it, and I just kept thinking about the optics too of the white social workers coming in to remove black babies.
Mm.
And so especially with the final young family that you talked about, Shatoya, I believe.
Mm.
And she had just had a baby. And these women show up with police officers to take her newborn baby, upon whom no CPS report had been filed. I was like, so there's no CPS report being filed about this child. There are other children in the home who are able to remain in the home. And here you are, as you don't have a badge, but guess you have your CPS badge, and you're coming to take a newborn baby out of their mother's arms for what? And I and I'm like, and you're supposed to be an educated adult. Like how does that make sense? How do you see that as you being protective instead of you creating harm? Like, how do you not see that as creating harm in that family's life?
Yeah, it's a light bulb. It's awareness. It's a reckoning that you see very clearly mine through the book. You see
Mhm,
the painful parts of my journey and the journey of me, in my opinion, literally waking up to what was
mhm,
happening.
mhm,
And when
mhm.
I actually witnessed what you just described with them coming in, searching the house for this newborn, and as I was watching it happen, I thought, this can't be real. They can't think
Right.
this is okay, right? But I knew then they hadn't woken up. They were literally moving through the motions, doing what they were told. But they can't possibly look over that a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, and justify it. At least I don't think so.
No, not if you're a thinking adult. If you have even a modicum of thought to yourself, there's no way.
Mhm.
Because you would have to be able to reflect at some point.
Are we getting the bullhorn? Is it time to rein it in? I see her coming in. You're on mute.
So I'm here just to say this is a fantastic conversation. I feel like I have a better understanding. And also, where I felt sad, I still feel a little sad, you
Mm.
know, about what's going on. But if anyone in the event has a question, and you want to either email it to me at allison.sourcebooksellers@gmail, or you can put it only for the panelists to see in the Q&A, that's fine. But since we're sort of winding down a little bit, can I get my questions in?
Of course,
This
you're the
the
boss.
chat the chapters in this book are a bookseller's dream.
You know,
Okay,
you
so
know, can I just tell you that no one has mentioned that until you? No one has mentioned that. So I feel really, really gratified that you brought that up.
when I was reading it, um, I said, "Oh, look, the new Jim Crow. Oh, look, Torn Apart. Oh no, Fire Next Time." We have all those books. And so, can you just tell us how um, you decided to use those terms? I mean, they probably fit with the cases a lot, but I mean, even the tidying up, it's like Marie Kondo.
Yeah, so for those who haven't, gotten the book yet, and I hope if you do, you get it from source. So if you haven't got the book yet, please get it from source. Every chapter is, named after a book that I have read. Some of them I've read a couple of times, and the books truly impacted me. So as I was organizing my book and really thinking through each chapter and really trying to really think about the themes of each chapter, I told myself, I said, I really want to theme each chapter by a book. So every book that's on there, it definitely connects to the content in the book, but in a deeper way, every book that I listed, some of them are nonfiction and some of them are even fiction. Every book that I listed impacted me at my core and brought out a level of awareness that I hadn't had before. So every time I read one of those books, I grew as a person, my mind grew, I expanded the way I thought. And because this entire book that I wrote is about helping the workforce and our community partners expand the way they think critically, reimagine, I thought, why wouldn't I create this journey through my story, the journey through my professional development alongside books that have really impacted me to my core?
Now, you do have a Brene Brown book on your list, right?
Mhm.
And I did want to get your take on the controversy with Brene Brown and African American social researchers. Because there's been a big outing of her utilizing Black women's research and not giving them due credit. I don't know if there's truth to that, but it seems it's beginning to sound more and more credible as
Mhm.
more and more African American women social researchers have come forth to share their stories. So
So
now, would you change?
no, I wouldn't
Okay.
change it, but
So
um,
you still like that book?
yeah, because it was really about at that moment what the book did for
Okay.
my own personal growth. But I will say, and this is conjecture because I must admit I don't know
Yeah.
what's going on with Dr. Brown, but I've heard rumblings. But what I will say is she's not the first person to research vulnerability and shame. I think we
Right.
know that. She isn't the first person. But the thing about life is sometimes people research something and they're not seen, particularly researchers of color. They do the work and they're in the lab and they're doing all this work. And then somebody comes along and adds to it and then they blow up. And I think that's what happened with her. I mean, she's the face of shame and vulnerability, but a lot of us know that that research has been going on for years. But
Right.
unfortunately, I think that visibility, and when you do get that sort of visibility, I think it is your responsibility to highlight and, you know, platform the work that the shoulders that you stood on. And
Mhm.
I don't know if she has, but to your point, I wouldn't doubt it because I think that sometimes we don't take that responsibility seriously. The idea
Right.
of I'm in this position because of a lot of people, and I want to make sure that's clear, and not everybody does that.
I just wanted your take on that.
Yeah, no, this is great. I appreciate it. Atlas of the Heart is the book you're talking
Yeah,
about.
Atlas of the
Well,
Heart is the book. Because I was
yeah.
reading it, and then when I started to hear these stories, I
Mhm.
put it down. I was like, well, I don't want to read anymore.
Yeah. And Atlas of the Heart I really connected when I was reading that book. It connected so well to Jatoya's story. And
Yes.
I always
Just
tell
like
people.
Evicted connected so well to Dee Dee's.
Mhm.
Yeah, you nailed it. You nailed it. Each chapter nailed it. Definitely.
Well, I always tell people that when I was meeting with these moms and talking to them, it wasn't always what happened in your case. That
Yeah.
came up, but a lot of it was what made you want to be a mom? When did you first want to be a mom? How
Mm.
did you feel when your baby started walking? Like what did you feel when your baby kicked? Like I wanted to get to know them. I wanted to get to know their road to motherhood. And
Mhm.
out of all of the people in that book, I mean, the heart she had for being a mom, it really truly impacted me. And it just connected really well, in my opinion, to like literally an atlas of the heart. That love for motherhood birthed in her well before she became a mom. And I
Yeah.
just felt like that led her to where she was. Yeah.
And I also really appreciated the how you juxtaposed um removing children and slave auctions, because you do hint at it. You said there is some things here that are left over from enslavement.
Mm,
There are some things here that we're still doing to Black families and families navigating poverty that we began or we learned to do during enslavement. And I thought that so so there are those of us in social welfare, in social work, who of course work really diligently at maintaining cultural sensitivity and making sure that our practice is culturally relevant for the children and families that we serve. And then there are so many individuals who are in these fields who are culturally numb and blind
mm,
and don't know that there's an ongoing connection with the way that families of color are treated in systems that are reminiscent of enslavement um, and all of the discriminatory practices that have been taking place in this country since its founding. So I appreciated that, in that, I kept asking myself throughout the book, as you gave each vignette and each mother's story, I kept asking myself, if she were white,
mm.
what would this be? If she were white, what would this story be? What would the outcome have been?
Yeah, I asked that same question. And to your point about just the juxtaposing it with slave auctions and slave patrols, there's a lot of money in this system, and people
Mhm.
don't like to talk about it. People don't like to say that out loud. That there's a lot of money pushing this industry, and I think it became really clear to me when a child welfare professional said that she left the field when they started giving her bonuses when she finalized an adoption. Whenever an adoption went through, she got a bonus, but there was no kudos when you brought a family back together
Mm.
and really tried to heal those bonds that we severed, right? So that's an interesting way to put, to incentivize pulling a family apart. So that's really the connection that I was trying to make. There's a lot of money that's, moving through hands. And I had an interesting discussion with a gentleman who read the book recently, and he used to live in North Carolina. So keep that in mind with your Toya story.
Mhm.
And the foster parents in that story. And he had this moment because he left the field. He said, I can't do this anymore. It feels like reminiscent of slavery. And but his job was licensing foster parents. And as he read this book, he started putting the timeline together, and he said, Jessica, I think I probably licensed them. Like he said, I probably licensed those people that took her kids. So that moment was huge for him because he thought, that's why I left the system, because I'm going through the system licensing folks, and then reading my book. It just, and do we know if that's true? We don't know. But he was working during that time, and these people had to get licensed to become foster parents.
Right.
And we see how that story ended. So it was just a very interesting way this book is really hitting people as they read through it.
Okay,
question. Your question.
Question number 2.
Okay.
Community partners. Who would be described as a community partner? I'm asking because I'm wondering, as a former teacher, as a person that just walks around, as a bookseller, how can the community help or grow to help?
So the child welfare workforce are really people that are carrying cases and protective work, and case managers, case workers. Child welfare professionals are teachers, principals, people that do therapy in the community, substance abuse treatment centers, housing authorities, because those are our partners in the community that are supposed to really be helping families. And then I also talk about literally community members, booksellers, right? Librarians. Like that was I think I listed librarians in there because kids come into the library. Like when you interface with kids, I need you to be a part of this conversation, to be honest, right? I think that I tell people all the time, a CPS professional interacts with all of these partners, and not every month and not every week, every day. This is one of those jobs where you have to talk to so many different people. You're even talking to people's neighbors when you're investigating them. So you're talking to a random neighbor. This is not a person in the community. You're talking to a person that lives in this neighborhood next to the family you're investigating. So a couple of things just to think about. If you're like, well, where do I fit into this? I think it's important for us to take responsibility and consider ourselves a part of child safety and family well-being. So if you live in a community, of course, the big dream is that it's easier to support each other in a community rather than report each other. So we really want communities to become more cohesive. So the other day I was in a talk and somebody said, when I read your book, I really wanted to get to know my neighbors. And that made me feel really happy because this hits people differently, right? So this young woman, she said, I live in a neighborhood. I've been living here for 3 years and I don't know anybody. And she said, I want to know my neighbors because if I do see them interfacing with a challenge or having a hard time, it's going to be a lot harder to report somebody than to report somebody who you actually are in a relationship with. So I would encourage you to do what you can to build cohesion in your community. And then for those who work in the library or work in a community center and you interface with kids, if you do have some concerns, I do have some resources in the book for anyone who has a concern about child safety. To consider those resources, ask yourself some questions, and then take some necessary steps to really process it with somebody you trust. Again, before you, in my opinion, really pick up that phone and really start a chain of events that could end the way it ended for families in my book.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Thank you. Do we have any final words, Miss Wanda?
Yeah, Ms. Wanda, any final words? Thank you so much. This is amazing.
Yeah, I thought the book was excellent. And definitely is something that I think should be read in MSW programs and BSW programs. Because we need to start bringing these critical thinking questions to the forefront, right? Because I do think that it makes you it awakens your critical thinking. around how we are supporting families for real. How we really are we really about the business of protecting children?
Mm.
And we see so many instances where Child Protective Services has failed families. Um, but we don't see very and of course the instances where Child Protective Services has served and saved and helped children, don't as promoted as the failures, right? And when the failures happen, because the failures happen and they're always traumatic, it always results in the death of a child or the gross neglect that has left a human completely devastated with lifelong scars. So I do think that those of us who are working in child welfare and work with children should read the book, number one, because we need to start asking ourselves these very critical questions. Am I really serving this family, or am I simply serving a system? Because if you're just serving a system, then you're probably not serving the family. And I think that Dr. Price's book makes all of us ask that question. Am I serving the family, or am I serving the system? And if I'm serving the system, how is it aiding? So I thank you for this book. I really do. And I thank you for your transparency in your journey, because I know I was telling my family when I was reading, I was just like, I never even thought about telling. No one wants to hear from social workers and what we do and what we go through. And I was just like, but the way you told the story is like, it's so compelling. I was like,
Mm.
more social workers need to tell. We need to tell our stories.
Social workers are my favorite people. Stop, Wanda.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. So we do. More social workers need to tell our stories. And I hope that you inspire more of us to come forward and share, our own journeys, and so that people know that there are humans behind those calls.
Dr. Price?
Yeah, thank you so much, Wanda. The couple of things that I'll end with is, I think in the book I talk about this idea of revolutionary work. And I think sometimes when you think about revolutionary work, it feels really big and you feel like, I can't do that, it's just too big. But when you read about it, and I think I listed a couple of books in the back of the book, when I read about revolutionary work and doing things profoundly differently, the revolution is not always loud. There's this terminology, the revolution will not be televised, right? So the revolution can happen tomorrow with how you treat a mom on your case. The revolution can happen tomorrow with how you treat a youth when you're trying to find a placement. And instead of throwing them in foster care, you say, who already loves this child? Who
Right.
already knows this child? Like, that's
Right.
revolutionary, because right now foster care is the rule. But I keep telling people, I can't wait until kinship care is the rule and foster care is the exception. Like, if you place a child in foster care, this is what I'm hoping for one day. When you place a child in foster care with strangers, it should have red flags for everybody in your office to say, you did what? Like, why would you do that? Like, what happened? Because we need to shift toward kinship care is the goal. If a child needs protection, let's exhaust all avenues to keep that child with somebody who knows them and already loves them. Again, foster care needs to be the exception to family preservation. And I just wanted to end on that.
So, do you have a final word, Janet Jones?
Oh, I do. I've been listening all along. I didn't need to be on the screen. First of all, I want to thank both of you young women for doing what you do and the way that you do it. I am totally convinced that we are revolutionaries all the time. There's no break in it. Every opportunity that comes your way or comes to my way here in the store is when I spout, as Allison knows, my revolutionary ideas to whoever they seem to fit. And it's our job, I think, as women in particular who understand both sides of the mental capacities, to speak up for what we know to be true. Now, I'll just end on this one note. I've been reading a lot of biographies lately, and I just read the new biography that's coming out on Mary McLeod Bethune. I would
Mhm.
recommend that to both of you because she was a revolutionary, she was an activist, she was a financier, she was a politician, she was a everything. And at the core of all of that was her uplift of the race. That's
Mhm.
what they spoke in those days. And it just reignited in me my interest in political science and sociology and all the things I studied in college to continue to say what I know to be true. And I would certainly urge you to take courage and just go ahead and keep going. Thank you so much for being with us. You have really helped us to light a new fire under our category of books called By and About Women. Right,
Mhm.
Alec?
Yes, so my final my final ask is a call to action to purchase your copy of Broken from us or any other independent bookstore and to read it with others or read it by yourself. There are so many resources and book recommendations in this book. And make sure that you check out the Social Work Ladies podcast and Fear Free Living blog. Um, to if you are online, and thank you so much for joining us. And I hope that if you have the book, you're reading it a little closer now, and if you and now you know you need it. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.